So we see that the woman is distinct from the man, but she is a man. And also she shares the name, the dominion, and the authority of the man. Now we're going to quickly do an overview of the Old Testament and see a being that is distinct from God, but also shares the name, the dominion, and the authority of God. In Genesis chapter 16, verse 10 says, "The angel of the Lord said unto her," to Hagar, "I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude." Now, we could say maybe because he's speaking on behalf of God, he is speaking in the first person. But in verse 11, the latter part says, "Because the Lord hath heard thy affliction." Here, there's a distinction made between the I and the Lord. So this being is not speaking just in the first person because he's speaking on behalf of the Lord. He is distinguishing himself. He's saying that I am the one who's going to multiply your seed, and the Lord is the one who has heard your affliction. Further to that point, verse 13, Moses, the author, says, "She called the name of the Lord that spake unto her." So here we see a being that is distinct from the Lord, but the being is the Lord because that's who spoke to her according to Moses. Also, this being in verse 10 says, "I will multiply your seed exceedingly." But this promise is given to Abraham concerning Ishmael in chapter 17 of Genesis, verse 20. God speaking here says to Abraham, "I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly." This being assumes the prerogatives of God by making the promise that God made to Abraham. In chapter 21 of Genesis, we find the angel of God appearing to Hagar in verse 17 and says that the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad." Again, distinguishing himself from God. But in verse 18, he says, "Arise, lift up the head and hold him in your hand, for I will make him a great nation." God, who is distinct from me, has heard the voice of the lad, and I am going to make him a great nation. But back in chapter 17, verse 20, the latter part, God says, "I will make him a great nation." Again, this angel of God, distinct from God, is assuming the authority of God by making the promise of God and saying, "I'm going to be the one to fulfill this promise." Moses continuing in chapter 23 of Exodus, God speaking to Moses says in verse 20, "Behold, I send an angel before thee to keep thee in the way and to bring thee into the place which I have prepared." Now, this is, of course, not God because God is speaking of a distinct being, this angel. "Beware of him and obey his voice. Provoke him not." Why? "For he will not pardon your transgressions." Now, this doesn't seem to suggest that he's not able to pardon your transgressions, but he will not pardon your transgressions. This is something that he normally could do, but in this case, he's not going to do. Now, this will be a no-brainer if we're just talking about a regular angel. Of course, angels cannot pardon transgressions because one of the few things the Jews got right in the New Testament is that only God can pardon transgressions. But here we find an angel who is distinct from God, who has the ability to pardon transgression. The latter part continues, and God says, "My name is in him." Here we find that this angel, distinct from God, shares the name of God. Also in Joshua chapter 5, verse 13 says, "A man appears to Joshua." But in verse 14, it's the man identifies himself as the captain of the host of the Lord. This is, of course, distinct from the Lord because he's the captain of the Lord's hosts. But then Joshua falls on his face and worships this captain of the host of the Lord. In Revelation 19, an angel forbids John to do the same thing because angels do not receive worship. Only God is to be worshiped. But this being accepts Joshua's worship and even goes further in verse 15 to command Joshua to take his shoes off because the place that he's standing on is holy, commanding the same action that Moses was commanded when he was in the presence of the great I Am. Continuing the story in chapter 6 verse 2, the Bible says, "The Lord said unto Joshua." So here we find now that this captain of the hosts of the Lord is the Lord. Just like Eve was distinct from the man, but is the man. This being is distinct from the Lord, but is the Lord. Just like Eve was distinct from the man, but shared the name of the man, the authority and the dominion of the man, this being is distinct from the Lord, but shares the name, the dominion, and the authority of God. We see here again this singular plurality, this plural singularity here, and this suggests to us the way in which we'll see in the New Testament the revelation of Jesus, the revelation of this, I believe, the same being who is distinct from God, but is God, and shares the name, the dominion, and the authority of God.